A very warm welcome to our global audience connected with us for this webinar on setting up program of activities. I am Chandani Dinakaran with the World Bank Institute of Climate Change Practice. This webinar is first in a series organized jointly by UNDP through its MDG Carbon Programme and the World Bank Institute Climate Change Practice in collaboration with WBICC Institute. The overall webinar series, POA and Beyond, will comprise 5 webinars from now until June 2014 discussing program of activities, also referred as POAs. If we had to brush up on the provenience of POAs, we can clearly say that POAs have been introduced to overcome some of the shortcomings of the project level CDM. In particular, POAs allow inclusion of mitigation activities across countries and sectors in one program. They also allow inclusion of multiple small-scale activities that would not have the necessary scale for a stand-alone CDM project. And now, as we commence the first webinar of the series, please allow me to introduce our eminent speaker, Mr. Randall Spalding,
All right.
Senior Advisor, Carbon and Energy Carbon Limits. Mr. Spalding will introduce and refresh the concept and regulatory framework of POAs and will provide an overview of the role that CMEs play in a POA and what are their responsibilities in setting up and managing POAs. So without any further ado, it's over to Randall.
Hi, Chandni. Thank you very much. Hopefully the technology is all working okay. Everybody can hear and see. Let me just go back here to the title page. So yes, thanks to the UNDP and to the World Bank Institute for the opportunity to speak on this topic. And I think we can look ahead to a very interesting set of webinars on this topic. So as she said, what I'm going to do really is go through a couple of areas. I'll provide a quick review of some of the regulatory issues. I think there are a lot of resources out there now on the basics of POAs, but I'll talk a little bit more about the structure of POAs, what the actual coordinating and managing entity, the CME, needs to do, and specifically around some of the tricky parts like developing eligibility criteria for new activities and their management system. And at the end, I'll point you to some additional resources that may help you to learn more about this. So just a little bit of a review. POAs, the key thing here about POAs versus conventional CDM projects is they are frameworks, not simply activities. So within that framework, you can have an unlimited number of individual activities, which gives them a lot of flexibility. And it's really the role of the CME to design and to coordinate this overall program and put the framework together. Interestingly, there are not fixed rules about how to structure this, so I'll talk about some different variations, and that could be something we talk about in the questions segment as well. But the big thing is that having the possibility of multiple countries, multiple locations, and adding those after registration gives you a tremendous amount of flexibility. Also very useful for programs that have a lot of dispersed small and micro-scale activities where it's hard to know in advance exactly where all your locations will be. In terms of just some basic rules, you know, all the rules that are in things like this new project standard and project cycle procedure, the validation and verification standard, that all applies to POAs, and in most of those documents there are sections on POAs. They all use the same methodologies. You do have more flexibility though than in normal projects because you can use multiple technologies and methodologies in one program. We're working on a couple of rural electrification programs where this is very important because often there are many different technologies used to achieve rural electrification, as an example. In terms of validation, obviously because you're going to have potentially a lot of activities in the future, you don't have to have all of those ready at once. You need to submit one real CPA with the POA at registration. And after that, then basically any CPA or a new activity can be included as long as 2 things happen. The CME first has to go through their checklist to make sure it complies with all the requirements for that POA. And then secondly, a DOE also has to sign off on that. So you don't get away from that requirement for third-party verification. Verification is a little bit different though, firstly because you can use sampling. This is extremely important because if you have a program with large numbers of dispersed activities, obviously monitoring them all would be prohibitively expensive. So there's a specific standard available to give you guidance on how to choose from within that larger population. Also importantly, although you may have different actors involved in different CPAs, from the executive board's point of view, the request for registration and for issuance are only from the POA overall. So part of structuring this program is how those benefits will flow through to individual CPA owners. Now, I just want to take, and this comes, some of these points about designing POAs come from, there's a new resource I'll point you to called the POA Platform, and these particular points were from perspectives there about what do you want to be shooting for ideally. Your design of a POA needs to transparently explain not only what you're trying to achieve, but how you will achieve it. What are the kind of incentives you'll put in place, particularly if you had outside project developers that might run specific CPAs. You need to enable them to participate easily and for it to be clear how they would engage with this overall program. Thirdly, you need to provide sufficient information in your design of the program so it will meet all the CDM checklists. So for example, all the additionality requirements need to be part of your designing. But more than that, you're really setting up a business plan. So it's not just doing the documentation. You need to have a business plan that's manageable, that's realistic, and that has a whole management system for how you will relate to and monitor the individual activities over time and report that to the Secretariat. This fourth point, sometimes people miss, this defining who owns the emissions reductions. That's not always obvious in POAs. If you have consumers using particular technologies, if you have technology providers as well, you might have financiers, so you have a number of different parties, and it must be clear who owns those emissions reductions. You also need to assign your responsibilities for monitoring well in advance, so that's clear. So there's a lot more that goes into this design than just what's in the POA design document. That's what I want you to understand. So just carrying on, thinking about structure, on the left-hand side, you'll see initially when I heard about POAs, I kind of assumed that the organization that was the CME that developed the overall program would also develop all the components. So for example, we're working with some national energy authorities who are in charge of electrification. So in this case, in many cases, they are the implementing agent for the various parts of the electrification program, but not always. You might have a situation on the right-hand side where the CME is not the same as the actual project participants in each CPA. You might have multiple entities which then tap into the incentive structure. So these are kind of two ends of the spectrum, and there are many variations in between. Obviously, if you take an integrated approach, if everybody's kind of part of the same organization, that might make it administratively simpler, but it also reduces the flexibility because you don't have the chance to benefit from the activities of other actors in that sector. Obviously, if there is some separation of organizations, though, you need very transparent management and incentive structure. So all the CPA owners know what they're getting to. Because remember, CERs are not issued to individual CPAs. They're only issued to the overall POA. So carrying on, let's think a bit about the role of the CME. So I've talked a little bit about design and structure, so the CME must make those decisions. And I mentioned this issue of documentation. I'm going to dig in a little bit more to some specific areas of documentation that are sometimes difficult. And this is additionality and eligibility criteria and the management system. I'm going to show you some examples of those. Additionality, the key message here is rather than evaluating or demonstrating additionality for a particular site or investment, what you do in a POA is you set up a process, and that process will then be used for each incoming CPA. And these points here on this slide are just relate to the fact that depending on the scale of the individual CPAs, whether they're large scale, small scale, or micro scale, you will use the additionality guidelines for that scale of activity. But you're not doing that for individual investments yet. It's the process. So what you have to do in terms of eligibility is those must be integrated into the eligibility criteria. So this is one of the big jobs of the CME. You have to put together a list of criteria that every CPA will be checked against before it is included in the POA. Now the project standard provides the minimum set of criteria, but the board or DOEs could add more, or there might be something more because of what this particular methodology you're using. The third point here is really important. These criteria have to be verifiable. It's not enough for the CPA to say, yes, we meet these requirements. There has to be some kind of documentation, and I'm going to show you a couple of examples there. Do you ever need to update these criteria? Well, you might. If your methodology is put on hold and then revised after that, or if your boundary changes, or if you're renewing your crediting period, you might need to update those criteria, but normally you wouldn't. Okay. What are the minimum criteria? So this is from the project standard. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. All these slides are really here for you to refer back to later on anyway. Obviously, the criteria needs to specify the boundary, avoiding double counting. I'm going to show you an example just now, so I won't talk about that just yet. There may be many different technologies and measures, so the limitation of those need to be specified in the criteria. The start date of the CPA, that's important. How will you check that? Because obviously CPAs are not supposed to start before the overall program starts, and you need to be able to verify that. The methodologies themselves could have criteria that need to be met, and those need to be integrated into the overall POA eligibility criteria. Obviously, additionality criteria important, we mentioned that. Any specific requirements around EIAs or other large-scale methodology requirements. Use of ODA. Target group, this is important. You know, I talked about you need to specify how will the POA interact with individual users or with CPA owners. So those distribution mechanisms are important. I mentioned sampling before. There's an actual sampling standard, so you need to specify in the criteria how CPAs must meet that sampling standard. And then if you're working with, I made a mistake here, that's supposed to be SSC, small scale CDM, not SCC. If you're working with small or micro scale activities, the aggregate, the total size of the CPA can't go over those limits. So you need to explain how are you going to check that for your CPAs. And then finally, a debundling check. You can't be chopping up big activities to make them to meet the requirements of the small scale rules. So let's look at an example. I've taken this is the most recently, if I'm not mistaken, the most recently registered POA is an energy efficient commercial lighting POA from Standard Bank in South Africa that works on a number of different countries in Southern Africa. So what have they done here? The two criteria, double counting, avoiding double counting, and start date are here on the left. And you'll see on the right, they provided different possible documentary evidence that you as a CPA owner, a CPA project participant, could submit in order to verify that you meet this criteria. So for example, to avoid double counting, you can check the CDM database to make sure that your activity is not already in there. You could confirm, in this case, this POA works with commercial buildings, so you can have a confirmation from the building owner that they are not participating in the CDM in any other way. Or you could also use the location, GPS coordinates, because the GPS coordinates should be reported in any CDM project activity or POA. Similarly, with start date, there are different ways or different forms of evidence you could submit to confirm your start date. You could look at the signing of the agreement with the CME, the date where you actually purchase the equipment for this particular CPA, or when that equipment is installed. So the idea is all these would be linked to documentation that could be provided both to the CME and to the DOE to evaluate. Management system, I mentioned that before. So this management system has a number of different components, obviously the roles and responsibilities of all the personnel involved. And interesting is this point here about a review of their competencies, because think about it, what a POA is doing is almost more like operational entities do. They're having to evaluate a number of many CPA applications over time. So the DOE has to evaluate, do they have the skills to actually do that? Right? So any training and capacity development that's needed to make the POA work is going to have to be in the management system as well. The actual process that you follow when you include CPAs, double counting procedures, which I mentioned on the previous slide, and then the whole database, all the data that's going to be recorded and control processes for each CPA. And finally, the measures for continuous feedback need to be monitored. So again, I'm not going to go through all this text here. This is pulled from that same POA, and what they've done in terms of responsibilities is they've listed each major operational area and then put in on the right-hand side all the tasks. Now, most of these tasks in this case are actually carried out by the CME, but you'll see I've highlighted in the third row lighting supplier and other contractors. So if there are other parties that need to fulfill certain responsibility in the overall management plan, you can specify this here as well. So again, it's something you can come back to, but they've made quite a comprehensive list. And you'll find tables like this quite commonly in the management plan. I'm going to actually go 2 slides ahead because the database, I think this is perhaps a better example, assuming that you can see the print. Basically, this specifies for this particular POA all the individual bits of data that must be collected. So you'll see on the far left, the actual boundary of the CPA means that you need to put in the database the building address, client details. There are a whole list of equipment information that need to go in the second 2 boxes, then some metering information, and finally checking the operation. So all of these bits of data are specified in the POA design document, and they go into the monitoring report. Now obviously behind this, there's the actual physical database development that you would be in charge of as a CME. I think we just have, yes, last slide, so we're going to wrap up on time. I just wanted to point you to some other useful resources. So you'll see this POA platform has just been launched recently. It's supported by KFW, and I had pulled a couple of slides from perspectives off of that platform. There's some good resources there. Obviously, the Secretariat has all of their reference manuals and documents on their site. And the E-Institute at the World Bank itself has an entire course on POAs, which you might want to refer to, and of course, the upcoming webinars as well. So that's all for my presentation. I think we're going to move to some questions now and hear what people are thinking. And I think they asked that I could read these questions just to make sure they're clear. So I'm going to read the questions and you guys can cast your votes there on the screen. So here's the first one. The recent shift to the CDM project standard and the revision of the submission forms has made a major impact on POAs. So would you say you strongly agree with this, not completely convincing, or you don't agree with it at all? And I'm not sure, I must ask the host, how do we know that everybody has actually answered? I'll give you a couple of minutes to see how many have responded. I think, okay, the numbers have slowed down, so I assume most people have casted their vote, and you'll see we had about a third who agreed and then some that weren't convinced. But I'd say my own view on this is they haven't made major changes, but what they have done is this shift to the project standard. It's really been an effort by the Secretariat to simplify and clarify a lot of issues. So you don't have to go to 15 different documents to find out information. You can find it all in one place. So in that sense, I think there is some streamlining, but the fundamental rules around POAs haven't changed. So let's go on. I think I can do this. Okay, secondly, are POAs more expensive to develop than traditional CDM projects? Again, you can cast your votes whether you strongly agree with that, not quite sure, or feel that's not the case at all. And we'll give you a minute to do that. Okay, it looks like the numbers have kind of firmed up, and so we're a bit split on this. And I think it's a difficult question. Certainly, your upfront costs, I think you are going to be more. I mean, your upfront costs, the recent estimates I've seen could be as much as twice a normal project. However, you've got to think of over the long run, your costs are going to be lower because now, of course, when you include your second, third, and fourth CPA, the marginal cost of that is much, much lower than doing a new CDM project. So yes, up front, you're going to have some additional costs that you need to be aware of. but over the long run, it probably is more cost effective. So it becomes an issue of really managing the cash flow and how you can work with your financiers to do that. Okay, let's go to question 3. And this is the POAs. POAs can provide a bridge between traditional project-based CDM and new mechanisms such as sectoral crediting and new market mechanisms. Okay, I think we're about done there, and it looks like about 2/3 of us are strongly agreeing. I think I would agree in principle. I can also understand people who say not completely convincing. I think the reason, yes, in theory, doing a more programmatic approach and looking over entire sectors should definitely help us to prepare, and we should be very active in POAs for that reason. At the same time, I think there's very little detail out there on what these new mechanisms are really going to look like. So in that sense, I think that the jury is still out on whether and to what extent we will end up applying all of our CDM experience. I certainly hope we will apply all of our CDM and particularly POA experience to these mechanisms. Okay, so now we're going to move to the next phase where we can take. And what I've asked is that the World Bank Institute people can consolidate these questions a little bit for me. I think for me to try to read all the comments at the same time and respond to them could be difficult. So I think what we'll do is they've been looking through some questions and we'll pose them on behalf of the participants. Is that right?
Thank you, Randall, for Mr. Thomas Black explained indeed when the first of its kind can be used in a POA to demonstrate additionality. Is it the first application of a methodology or the first time that is implemented in the country?
Oh, that's a very good question. I mean, I would say my overall view on first of a kind is my sense is the board is trying to phase this out entirely, that they're not happy with this being used as a primary justification. So, I mean, I would have to kind of look up the current version of the rules, but I know there has been some recent guidance on this, and it wouldn't, if you had had a CDM project but not a POA, that probably still would mean that there's been some use of this technology. But I think if it was the first, certainly if it was the first POA in the country using that technology, and there had been no other normal CDM project, then your arguments are going to be much stronger. But again, I think you must be careful because my sense is the board and the MEF panel are very wary of using this as the central argument in additionality.
Great. I'm sure that answer was helpful for Mr. Thomas Black as well as all the audience joining in with us. Next, we have a question from Ms. Cynthia Menendez. Is there any relation between the POAs and NAMS?
Well, not formally. I mean, and I guess that last poll that we did might have led you to think that there was. There isn't formally, but the reality is when you hear people talk about NAMS and you hear them talk about POAs, they're often talking about similar types of activities. So they're looking at, for example, sector-wide activities that incorporate large, or sector-wide programs, I should say, in which many different activities or components could take place. So I think many people who are writing currently, like research people and experts who are writing about NAMS, are trying to draw on some of this POA experience. There are some differences, though, in that, for example, NAMS, if you have a goal, a sectoral goal for crediting or something like that, NAMS may be implemented also through policies. You might implement a number of sector-wide policies which lead to emissions reductions. There's not really a way to have crediting for that in POAs right now. So again, there's some lessons, and I think we should, as a community, push to use the experience and the lessons learned from POAs in the negotiations for the new mechanisms, but there isn't an explicit link. And I should say, on the other hand, sometimes you get people in the negotiations who are trying to distance themselves from the CDM, so they don't want any mention of CDM experience or rules in the new mechanisms debate. And that's obviously a political issue that we have to tackle.
Great. Randall, there's another question coming up, and this time it's from Sasha. So he would like to know that, is it possible under certain circumstances to implement policy measures as a CDM POA?
Okay, that's a good follow-on from the previous question. Now, the board has been very clear that you cannot earn CERs for the implementation of a policy. Now, but let me say a caveat to that. If a POA provides, for example, some type of incentive, so a financial incentive, say financing for cook stoves or something like that, I mean, one could argue that your policy in the country for promoting cook stoves could be to provide incentives. So if that were the case, then yes. But if it's a much broader policy, say an overall carbon tax or pricing policies or some standards and things like that, then it becomes very difficult. Because remember, you have to be able to show how the structure you set up under the POA takes the CERs and essentially provides some type of incentives for the individual CPA project participants who may not be part of your organization. And that's very difficult to do if it's a kind of a generic policy that doesn't relate to a specific financial incentive.
Thanks, Randall, again. And now we have, can a CMA include in its POA a country within its boundary without the consent from the country's DNA?
That's a good question, because you see some, if you look at the validation pipeline for POAs, you see many of them that have dozens of countries listed. So my understanding is, by the time the project is actually registered, you actually need letters of approval from all those governments. That's not necessarily required at validation stage. I mean, in other words, before it's submitted for validation. So my sense is that what a lot of project developers are doing is they are hoping that by the time they get to the validation process, which could take 12 months, so it's quite a long time, they will by that time be able to secure the letters of approval. Interestingly, there's kind of debate around, how do you to what extent can you add countries after registration? I think they're also looking at the rules for, how much change should you be able to make in a POA after it's registered. But that's a separate issue. I would say, in terms of thinking about the registration phase, you're going to have the approval from all the countries involved.
Thanks, Randall. So this discussion definitely looks very healthy and very interactive. So we again invite our audience that if they have any questions, to please post it up, because Randall is more than helpful and happy to definitely answer. Is that right, Randall?
Yes, yes.
It's again from Mr. Thomas Black, where he would like to know, is there any hope for price improvement on CERs?
Well, that's the $64,000 question, isn't it? I mean, this is the difficulty, of course, in working in the carbon market these days, even with POAs, is that we're faced with great experience, now a very smoothly working system, and no demand for the output. I mean, but I see a couple of positive things. I mean, in terms of the overall negotiations, I don't have a crystal ball, so I can't tell you how soon that's going to improve. What I think is interesting is I do believe, though, there are still people in the marketplace, and these are more of some of the larger carbon funds, who are interested in projects, particularly projects in least developed countries, of course, but there is an appetite for projects. And there is even the opportunity in those contracts to include a possible upside for the owner if the prices improve in the future. What I mean by that is, although prices are very low now, I've spoken to some people in large institutions that they don't expect this to go on forever. Maybe it will take 5 years, but even if it took 10 years and prices get back to 20 or 30 euros, obviously over the life of the CPA, that's very significant. So maybe this points to something we didn't really talk about, which is your negotiations with a carbon purchaser, because that's an opportunity for you to discuss how will you share that upside. I think at this point, it's hard to imagine there's much downside risk because prices are about as low as they can get. But there certainly is a tremendous amount of upside potential. So you want to make sure in that contracting process that you as a CME or as a developer of a POA can take advantage of that. The one thing, and this actually is, I think either Harmke Immink or Robbie Lowe might be on the conference, and they've been writing some things about structuring POAs. The picture that I showed you kind of implied that the CME is were the people who developed the project. That's not necessarily the case. In many cases, the CME could be, for example, it could be the financier of the project. It could be a carbon consultancy. Because the CME, obviously, as you saw from my presentation, there's a lot of responsibility and understanding of the CDM rules that's necessary. So as you think about who should be the CME, it might be that the agency or organization that originally developed the project is not the right entity to actually be the CME. And what I mean is that they might be the right people to manage the on-the-ground implementation of the program, the practical side of it. But in terms of the interface with the UNFCCC and the carbon market, it might be better to have an entity that does that who has the specific capacity to do that. And this is why, if you look down the list of POAs, often you'll see the CME is a consultancy or it could be a bank. In some cases, even something like a technology supplier. And I know Harmke was mentioning they're working on something in South Africa to have maybe an umbrella NGO organization that might do this for some POAs as well. So there are a lot of things to explore there. The key thing for you, if you are coming from the side of developing the project, is to make sure that your organization, whoever's going to manage this, has the skills and capacity to do that over the long run. Because remember, we're talking about 28-year programs here.
Thank you, Randall, again. And this time we have a question from Robbie, where he asks, for projects that prove additionality on a CPA level, can one use FOIC, F-O-I-K, in the first CPA and not thereafter?
I think that's related to Thomas's first question as well. You know, to be honest, I would need to check the rules to give you an exact answer. But my sense is using first of a kind as your main justification for additionality is always going to be a tough sell. I think my sense is that the board sees it more as a supporting argument rather than the main argument. And if it's a supporting argument, then this issue may not be quite as important. But I'll tell you, I'm going to make a note of that, and I will try to find out the answer and let you know.
Right. There's a question from Geoff Stills. Well, this question is more, I guess, for the future webinar, where he asked that will there be a discussion of POAs under the gold standard in a future webinar? Well, Geoff, we can answer that to you saying that we might cover it in the next webinar, where we are going to speak about the practical experiences in implementing POAs. So you should stay tuned to our next webinar as well. And Randall, there's another question from Alejandro Cor, and he wants to know which is easier to implement, NAMS or POA?
Okay, good question. You know, the tricky thing about NAMS, I should say, we can answer some questions about how easy it is to implement a POA because there are POAs. There are quite a few registered POAs now. NAMAs, yes, there are some lists of NAMAs, but there aren't any specific guidelines really for NAMAs yet. So it isn't difficult for a country, I think, to submit, to provide a submission to the UNFCCC Secretariat to say, this is what we're doing and we're calling it a NAMA. That's not difficult. There are no rules yet for the crediting of NAMAs, although there's a lot of discussion about this. Right now, there is not a mechanism for doing that, so that really isn't an option. Right now, the question would really be, if you can define the activity well, you can have it registered and report it in your national communication to the UNFCCC, but there isn't going to be a monetary incentive for that unless you have maybe a particular donor who wants to support NAMA programs. Now, if that's the case, what will happen is that de facto it's the donor who will determine what the hurdle is to get whatever financing they're going to provide. Again, most of what I've seen so far has been, some very small funding for, thinking about NAMAs. There are expert papers written by them, and some donors have provided some funding to develop kind of concepts. But because there isn't an actual crediting mechanism here, you don't have specific rules about the way you do in a CDM, what you have to do and what hurdles you have to cross to get some type of additional financial incentive because of the mitigation impact of the NAMA.
Right. Wants to know that if you can throw some light on the new guidance defining CPA types based on technology types, monitoring approaches, etc.
Well, let me give you a little bit of background. Again, initially when the CPA rules came into practice, the thought was that the CPA would still be focused on kind of one particular type of technology. So, for example, you might have a solar home system program of activities, and it's just a matter of the locations of those solar home systems change over time, and we'll package them into different CPAs. That was the initial thought. Then people realized, but actually, if you're going to be working in one particular area, it would be nice to have a couple of different technologies, and that was spread now to a couple of different methodologies. So then the question arose, if you're only required to submit one CPA, a real CPA, with your POA, how does the board, and even the DOE, how do they know that the POA will work for all the possible types of CPAs? Because if your CPA includes a couple of methodologies and several technology types, and those can be mixed and matched, you could potentially have many different kinds of CPAs. So my understanding of the current guidance is that although you don't have to submit one CPA of every possible type, and I'm talking about CPAs that have different, as you say, technologies, monitoring, etc., with the POA at registration, you will, every time, if you want to submit a new type of CPA, in other words, a type of CPA that has a different combination of methodologies or different combinations of technologies in the future, you will have to have, that will have to go through essentially another registration process. It can't be included as simply as a repeat of your first CPA. There will need to be some additional assessment, and I think the board itself has to review that assessment. I would have to double check, but that's my memory, is that just as the first CPA or CPA type that comes in with the POA has to be ultimately approved by the board, so these other ones will as well. But the compromise they're trying to make, I think, is that you don't have to do all of those up front. So that's my current reading. It probably means that as a project developer, I mean, you need to think through this. How much time and energy and effort can you spend? Probably better if you're going to have different types of CPAs with different technology combinations. If you can have those, do those up front, probably better, because it's going to then streamline the whole future process. But if that isn't possible because of practical reasons, there is this opportunity, I think, in the new guidance to allow that to be deferred.
Thank you, Randall. And there's another question from Sandeep, where he wants to know what are the procedures for changing the name of the CME in a registered POA.
I'm not, yeah, I'll answer this two different ways. I mean, it depends on changing the name. I assume he means actually changing who the CME is, not just the C. If the CME simply the organization is renamed, obviously I don't think that's not much of an issue. The question is, can you change the actual CME? Well, certainly you can't do it without the approval of the current CME. And I guess I'd have to think through this. If it's a completely different organization, I think that is going to be a challenge, because you remember what I went through in my slides. When a POA is validated, one of the things the DOE is looking at is the internal capacity of the organization to do the proper evaluation of future CPAs. I think I mentioned they have to actually review the competencies of your organization to evaluate each CPA against the eligibility criteria, etc. So if that's all been done, and that's the basis upon which the POA has been registered, and now you're going to totally shift organizations for that, I think that probably is a difficulty. I would need to look up to see the exact consequences, but I don't think you can simply use that. It would be like using your accreditation as a DOE and then kind of just shifting that accreditation to another entity. So that is going to be a challenge. If it's something that's smaller, so if the capacity and personnel that have been evaluated are simply, maybe that company is bought by another company or something like that. So functionally it's not really changing, even though it's changing in name, that probably isn't a big issue. But to change the capacity and resources that are applied, I think would be a challenge.
Thanks, Randall. We have another question from Azhar, and Azhar would like to know, can CERs from CPAs from new countries included to a POA after 2012 into a POA registered by 2012 be traded in the European Union ETS? And he also further gives us an example. He says that a POA registered in Malaysia in 2012 and later this POA is exported to Indonesia in 2013. So can the CERs from the Indonesian CPAs be used in the European Union ETS?
Right, and of course this was the hope of a lot of people, I think, is that they could get some POAs approved in 2012 and then expand them at a later stage, or that they could get them approved in a number of countries which included LDCs and make them eligible. A couple of thoughts on this question. First of all, as I said before, the CERs, the request for issuance for CERs is for the overall POA. But the actual monitoring reports obviously will come from individual CPAs. My understanding is that the CERs, though, could potentially be identified with different CPAs. So again, this is probably something I would need to dig into, because there are two different aspects of this question. One is, what are the UNFCCC rules, and one are, what are the buyer's preferences? So even if the UNFCCC says, well, it's all one POA, the buyer may view that differently. And remember, in this case, it's the EU, and it's their prerogative. And it's hard for me to imagine, given the resistance that many countries put up to their ruling to only accept from LDCs after the end of 2012, given how much political flack occurred around that, I think they wouldn't look kindly on a POA and where they're being asked to buy all of the, or allow in all of those credits, when the reality is a big chunk of them don't come from LDCs. So, I mean, the mechanism for that has to do with the operation of the registry and whether or not those CERs can actually be tracked back to the CPA. But whether or not that's possible, I think that in principle, I wouldn't want to risk it. Let's put it that way. If I ran a POA and I was trying to sell to an EU buyer who was then using those within the EU for compliance, I don't think I would want to take that risk without first consulting them and being sure that it doesn't jeopardize not only the new CPA, but it doesn't jeopardize the overall POA. But it's a very, very good question.
Randall, the next question is yet again from Thomas Black, where he would like to know, if you have a POA already registered for a sector, say sugar mills, with one technology, with a registration date of December 2012, can you add new CPAs with other technologies and methodologies to the existing POA, maintaining the original registration date?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question, and we're facing a similar situation. We have a project, well, actually, no, it's in an LDC, but I mean, we do have a project where we're trying to see how far we can go in terms of adding technologies or methodologies, and we've actually asked the Secretariat for a clarification on that, because I think it isn't clear. There aren't enough test cases yet to actually show how far you can push this post-registration change of POAs. There has been some guidance come out, but I think the jury is still out. From the point of view of the executive board, obviously, you know, they don't want people to be introducing completely different activities which really should go through registration. But the board is also, I think, actually trying very hard in this last year to really streamline these procedures and to use the POA process. So I think here's the first thing I would do is this, for the CDM community, is probably something we need to be vocal about, because the more opportunity there is to allow the broadening of a POA, the more efficient and fluid and effective the CDM is going to be. But I think right now there haven't been enough test cases. So my advice would be to check this with somebody in the Secretariat before moving ahead. But even if they come back negatively, it might be worth pushing. It might be worth pushing through some specific executive board members who might look upon it more favorably, or who are interested in using POAs to kind of push things more broadly. I mean, part of the debate here, I've even had someone say to me, who is a negotiator, you know, why should we be bothering with new market mechanisms? The CDM can actually do all that if you just took a broad enough view. And if the board were willing to kind of think outside the box in terms of how broadly these activities could be conceived, you could easily do sectoral crediting under the CDM and even policies. So far, the board hasn't been willing to do that. So I think there's a technical issue here. There's some issues with the Secretariat, but it may also be worth putting this in the ear of some of the negotiators, because to some extent, I think the board needs to be given guidance from the COP on this, that it's time to think as broadly as possible about POAs, which includes post-registration changes, to really make them a bridge to the next phase of carbon markets, going back to our earlier poll question. This is one example of how POAs could be a bridge. If you did allow fairly substantial changes within the same management framework, obviously, and still, you know, with the same kind of validation, but fairly significant post-registration broadening of POAs.
Thank you, Randall, for answering all the many questions. And now, as we are running short of time, unfortunately, we'll have to end the discussion and the webinar at this point. I would answer one question that's from Rakoto Mao, where they would like to know that from where can they download the video of this meeting. So for Rakoto Mao and the audience, the link for this recording with Randall's presentation would be available on the website within 24 hours from now. And as the clock ticks by, I would like to thank immensely for Randall for a detailed insight on POAs, our technical team for making it possible, and our audience for joining in and making the session a lot more interactive. But before we close, we would much appreciate to receive your feedback. We'll send a survey wherein you'll be asked of your preferred topics to be covered in the series. We would also like to know if you're interested to join a community of practice to allow continuation of discussions in between the webinar sessions as well. So hope to meet you all again on the 3rd of December, when we will discuss and learn more on POA experiences from the field, presented by Mr. Bill Farmer, Chairman of the Uganda Carbon Bureau. So until next time, thank you very much and wish you a very good day.